So that's, I mean, that's a big cause of conflict within Ngāi Tahu, and it's going to be ongoing for a wee while. So essentially what you've got is it's a distribution of wealth, I suppose. Some Ngāi Tahu rūranga are resource and asset rich. In this instance, Kati Waiwai have Pounamu and Pink Pine in their back doorstep. Kaikoura have got Whale Watch. Contrast that with the likes of Hokanui down in Ngāi, who don't really have too much to exploit. So in this instance, Ngāi Tahu Forestry Estate is acting as the conduit whereby it makes the money for all 18 rūranga and decides how that's distributed. With regards to Ngāi Tahu Forestry Estate's Pink Pine resource, Ngāi Tahu Forestry Estate is the second largest landholder on the west coast. And again, I apologise for the quality there, but you can see there are the forestry blocks indicated in green. Those where Pink Pine is known to be located have those stars on them, and at the moment Paparoa Forest is being felled, and that's where Pink Pine is currently being recovered from, at the moment being recovered by Westchem Industries. But it's also located down towards South Westland, and in the middle there, I think that's Hochstetter Forest. So it's sprinkled throughout the west coast. Ngāi Tahu manage above 50,000 hectares of the west coast, so there's a large forestry holding block there. And as of, well, up until 2014, Ngāi Tahu Forestry Estates were merely passive owners, in the fact that they had the ground, they had the land, and there was a ground lease to the likes of timberlands. So timberlands planted the trees, they had the rights to all the trees on the land. 2014 the game changed. Ngāi Tahu Forestry Estates acquired some of the vegetation rights on a number of the properties, I think about 23,000 hectares. About 23,000 hectares on the west coast. So that meant that all of a sudden, instead of being a passive participant in forestry, Ngāi Tahu could now actively go in and harvest timber. Now the prize to date has certainly been Pinus radiata, and in fact I think Pink Pine represents 0.02% of all income flows from forestry activities on Paparoa Forest. So it's insignificant, so there's no wonder that it's sort of flown under the radar. And certainly Westchem Industries, the company who have been processing Pink Pine for a wee while, it's in their best interest to fly under the radar too and not reveal the real value of this resource. So taking a step back, Ngāi Tahu now at a state where it can actively invest in its reinvigorating its traditional cultural practices. Now we've seen that with taramea. Taramea has been developed to a large extent. I don't think it's quite been commercialised yet, but Ngāi Tahu have done a lot of research into that. So taramea used to be used, used to hang around the neck of pre-colonial Māori as a natural fragrance. And following on from that, Pink Pine was also used in a similar manner. And I apologise, I don't have any samples here today, but what happened with it, the leaves from Pink Pine were spread underneath beds just to make it a bit more fragrant underneath the old the sleeping mats. So again, I guess it's identifying opportunities out of traditional activities, and I think we're just at the cusp, well Ngāi Tahu is certainly at the cusp of reinvigorating those practices, which is bloody exciting to see. So with regards to Paparoa Forest, 2014, Ngāi Tahu acquired the vegetation rights, and with that we acquired an agreement with Westchem Industries for them to come in and take Pink Pine. And they were doing that, they have done that for the past two and a half years. And all Ngāi Tahu were getting in return was $125 a tonne. So that's the monetary return we were getting. In addition to that, we were getting the benefit of having the land cleared too for replanting of Pinus radiata. Now how it works is, given that Pinus radiata is the primary source, we haven't provided access to Westchem to clean out Pink Pine until such time as we've harvested the Pinus radiata. So it depends on our harvesting program. We'll fell the Pinus radiata. Once that's done and cleared, Westchem come in and salvage what pink pine they can. I think at this point too, it's probably good to say that pink pine's unique in that the timber doesn't deteriorate. These logs here are 50, 60 years old. They look like they were cut down, within the past couple of weeks. The compound within pink pine, mannol, preserves it, and it, as I say, it doesn't deteriorate. So, out of my research, I found out that these blocks, the old forestry blocks on the west coast, were initially cleared to make way for returned servicemen from World War II coming back to provide employment for them on the west coast. So what they did, went in there, wholesale cleared the native vegetation, of which pink pine was cleared also, and built them up into windrows on these farms to help with drainage. So while all the other native timbers have rotted, pink pine's maintained its form, and it's only by virtue of the fact that it has maintained its integrity and it has already been felled that it can still be harvested. Otherwise, indigenous forests are protected by the Forestry Act, so you can't, without permission by the Department of Conservation and a couple of other Crown entities, you can't fell native timber. But we've got the benefit of this having been felled some 50 years ago, so it's lying dormant, waiting for collection within Ngāi Forestry Estates. It has a slow growth rate, takes quite a long time to maturity, and the compound that makes this different from every other timber in terms of preserving it and its aroma and its tenacity for perfumes is mannol. Now mannol is a combination of words, manawal, the Māori word manawal, which has since been applied to silver pine. Unfortunately the original Māori name for pink pine has been lost in time. So manawal and the OL suffix associated with alcohol. And as I say, it's highly valued in the fragrance industry for its tenacious properties. So it's used in perfumes to help the smell linger. It makes the smell stick around for a long while, and it does have a very unique smell. And in fact, it's one of the most natural compounds that assimilate ambergris, whale oil bile. So there we are there. The international perfume industry is quite secretive. It's very hard to get information out of. I managed to ascertain amber kettle varies in prices, but it was getting about $1,800 a kilogram. And that's the stuff you see washed up on the beaches. I think there are professional fossickers around Murihuku, around Fovo Strait, certainly around West Coast too. So it's out there if you know what you're looking for. Sorry, that's amber kettle. That's in its converted state. $10,000 plus per kg of ambergris, and eventually it ends up in the brands we're more familiar with, Chanel No. 5, Davidoff Coolwater. So the value add process is that's the raw ingredient that's extracted from pink pine, the timber, crude mannol. Mannol can further be purified down to pure mannol, and then that can be converted into amber kettle. So there are the skeletal compounds there for those of you that way inclined. And essentially, once you are down to amber kettle, it's only a couple of drops of that stuff in each of your 100, 200 ml perfumes, and that's where the real value is. So you're talking small quantities in the final product. Substitute, we've since found out, include clary sage, so that's sage, labdamen, and tobacco. And again, the quantity of these needed to produce the same amount of amber kettle make it fairly uneconomic. That's why there's a lot of value in it for, Westchem Industries have been realising a lot of value today, but certainly a lot of value for Ngāi Tahu to continue to develop that. As part of the project, I was liaising with Ferrier Research Institute, who are an offshoot out of Victoria University of Wellington and have an affiliation with the Callaghan Institute, so essentially a Crown entity charged with helping encourage research and development. They undertook the extraction of crude manole as well as producing purified manole, and were able to produce amber kettle. Now, one of the roadblocks that we stumbled across was the fact that while crude manole can be produced on a commercial large scale, it certainly can't be done for purified manole and amber kettle. So currently that knowledge and expertise exists with the perfume houses overseas. So as part of my information gathering process, some of those players that I liaised with, the NZ IPO, just to see if there wasn't a patent around the extraction process for manole from pink pine. New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, they were engaged to basically tap their contacts on the shoulder overseas and see if we could get a foot in the door with some of these perfumeries. As it turned out, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise weren't all that beneficial, didn't have the contacts that were required, and we're still working on getting direct access to international fragrance houses. Callaghan Institute through Ferrier Research Institute, as I talked about earlier. Pharmalic Extracts, now they're based up in Nelson. I've got an extraction plant up there. They specialise in supercritical fluid, carbon dioxide fluid extraction on a commercial scale. And Westchem Industries, so they're currently who Ngāi Tahu property, or Ngāi Tahu forestry estates are supplying pink pine to, and they're really the main player in the New Zealand pink pine market at the moment. So more on Westchem Industries. So little were known about these guys. As I say, income flows from pink pine only make up about 0.2% of all monies obtained for Ngāi Tahu forestry estates. So it's pretty insignificant. So not much attention were paid to these guys. They pretty much flew under the radar. They're based down in Dunedin, and I think they come about as a result of the old DSIR being disestablished from the Crown. So these guys were biologists and chemists, identified an opportunity that the Crown was going to no longer pursue, were employed by the Crown to investigate the potential for this. Government eventually turned off the funding, and they thought, Christ, here's a real opportunity. So they picked the ball up and they ran with it since, I think Westchem Industries has existed in one guise or another since at least the 1970s. So they've been going, just chipping away quietly, flying under the radar. As I say, we get $125, we being Ngāi Tahu forestry estates, get $125 per tonne of pink pine recovered, plus the added benefit of having the land worked over. So it has been really insignificant to us to date. Now, Westchem use an old, inefficient hexane extraction process. I'll talk to the supercritical carbon dioxide fluid extraction process in a bit more detail later on. But hexane leaves contaminants within the end product, so that yellow concrete crude manole on the left-hand side, that's left with a few contaminants in it using hexane. So Westchem Industries then have to further process to purify that substance. Now, we sat down and talked with Westchem Industries. Obviously, there's a bit of commercial sensitivity there. They were reluctant to release too much information, especially when we were the ones standing there with our hands out asking for a financial return. So they've been quite guarded in their response. What we were able to ascertain, and this is anecdotally, is that they were able to get about 30 kilograms of crude manole extract for 1 tonne of pink pine. Now, that was the limited information we had to work, well, I had to work with to try and determine levels of profitability. In terms of the supply chain, so you've got pink pine in its raw form, it's dug over, the windrows are dug over, currently removed by helicopter. That's the most efficient way of doing it at the moment, because some of these places in Paparoa Forest on the west coast are hard to access. Extracted by helicopter over to the local haul road, and then it's stockpiled there. And that's your transportation. So it's stockpiled, loaded onto trucks, and what Westchem Industries do is they relocate that from West Coast forests down to Dunedin, their processing plant. The logs are then chipped into about 2 centimetres, and then they are placed into extraction cells, and in Westchem Industries' instance, they use the hexane extraction process and end up with the crude manole. Now, Westchem Industries have been quite cunning in the fact that they also run a container sales and leasing business on the side too, from the same plant. So it's all pretty much run from the smell of an oily rag, but they've got direct access to international shipping and transportation. And as I say, they've been operating since at least the 1970s, so they've got some good contacts with 3 of the big names in the international perfume and fragrance industry in the form of Firmenich, Marnay and Symrise. So I started to identify that was part of the benefit that Ngāi Tahu are struggling to get. If we want to play in this market, we need direct access to the purchasers. And yeah, given the guarded nature of the perfume industry, it's bloody hard to do. So that's still work in progress from our perspective. There's a bit of detail on the comparison of the hexane extraction process which Westchem Industries currently use compared with supercritical carbon dioxide fluid extraction process, which was brought to our attention by the Ferrier Research Institute up in Wellington. So the main difference being there is hexane, contaminants in the concrete, and then you're only achieving a 3% yield. Contrast that with supercritical carbon dioxide, you're achieving a yield of 7.6%. So it's 250% more yield using a different process. There's a lot more capital required to start the supercritical carbon dioxide fluid extraction process up. And in fact, the cost of doing that isn't cheap given the current operators in the market. But yeah, working backwards without knowing the market value, I just had to try and ascertain via cost of production what Westchem Industries had to achieve for their crude manole extract. And I got to a figure of around $185 that it costs Westchem Industries to produce. Did the same theoretical exercise for Ngāi Tahu forestry estates and come up with a figure of about $195. So. And a lot of that cost is comprised of this here, the supercritical carbon dioxide extraction process run through farmerling extracts. So farmerling extracts are the biggest supercritical fluid extraction plant in the southern hemisphere, and they've got 3 850 litre extraction cells. In those cells, you can process 2 tonne of raw material at a time, 2 tonne of pink pine, but that comes with significant cost. So after every time that you've processed your raw material, there's a $15,000 clean out fee before you process the next batch, and there's a variable cost of $5,000 per tonne. So you're looking $25,000 to process 2 tonne of pink pine. Obviously there are a few efficiencies to be made there. If you're solely running pink pine in the one cell, you wouldn't need to clean it after every process. So that was the best I could do in terms of costs for market research. As I alluded to earlier, farmerling extracts can only produce crude manole on an industrial scale. They certainly don't have the capability to further process that, add value to produce amber kettles or purified manole. So again, we're still at the mercy of those international fragrance houses who are purchasing and doing that conversion internally. So to satisfy the requirements for the MBA, I applied a few business models and tools just to try and understand the situation a bit better and develop some strategies for what Ngāi Tahu could do. So it was pretty much starting from scratch, looking at the whole industry from purchaser through to producer, threats of new entrants. We haven't seen any new entrants or active participants in the pink pine market in New Zealand for some time. Westchem Industries have basically got the monopoly on it. Bargaining power of your suppliers. Again, part of Westchem Industries' secret is that they haven't let slip the real value of pink pine, so those supplying services don't really know. They are just providing a market rate service. I'm sure if they knew the real value, they'd want a greater slice of the pie, and that's certainly what's happened to Ngāi Tahu forestry estates anyway. Threat of substitutes, as I say, clary sage, tobacco, labdanum exist, but quite expensive to process and extract manol. So just a broad brush use of business tools there to try and ascertain a strategy for Ngāi Tahu. So out of those tools, applying those tools, I come up with 3 options. Essentially, Ngāi Tahu Forestry Estate could continue to charge Westchem $125 per tonne of pink pine. So that's essentially business as usual. There's significant room for added value there, so there's no way I was going to recommend Ngāi Tahu entertain that option. Option 2, review Westchem Industries stumpage sale agreement. So let's have a look at that $125 a tonne. Sit down with them and try and ascertain the real value of pink pine with Westchem Industries. Now again, it's not in their best interest to reveal what that value is, so we've had a hell of a time just trying to sit down and get that from them. I think we're at a stage now where, subject to a confidentiality agreement, they are willing to release that information. So, and that's come out of option 3. Option 2, which is I recommended that we look to develop a joint venture partnership with Westchem Industries. And option 3, Ngāi Tahu stockpile its pink pine resource. As I say, the feature of pink pine is that it doesn't deteriorate. We can afford to stockpile it, let it sit there while we go away and establish those market contacts within the industry. So there's a bit more detail on option 3 there, which explored in a bit more detail what price Ngāi Tahu per kg Ngāi Tahu needed to achieve if it was going to go down the path of processing pink pine itself. And part of the recommendation there was the option of Ngāi Tahu developing its own extraction plant. I mean, we don't need to be at the mercy of Farmerlink extracts up in Nelson. We can build our own bespoke extraction facility on the west coast. You're close to the source, but that also provides the ability to process not only pink pine once it's exhausted, but other timbers such as Sitka spruce or Douglas fir, which essential oils are currently being extracted from at the moment by smaller players within New Zealand. So again, some business tools. The business ownership model was something that I've tried to impress upon Ngāi Tahu Forestry Estates. Westchem Industries basically have the market locked up in that they've got access to the purchasers. Ngāi Tahu Forestry Estates currently do not. We've got access to the raw materials. So through the course of the project, we come to loggerheads, and again, there was a bit of patch protection. You know, Ngāi Tahu Forestry Estates were saying, look, we need that, we want that information from you. Westchem Industries are saying, no, it's not in our best interest to divulge that information. So the best way around that, I recommended more of a strategic alliance with Westchem Industries. And as I say, we're about to enter into a confidentiality agreement whereby they're going to divulge that information to us in return for a continuity of supply agreement with Ngāi Tahu Forestry Estates. So it's a win-win all around. So yeah, as of November 2016, those were my recommendations, and that's pretty much what has been followed, which is it's pleasing to see that my research has yielded some real tangible results. Problems identified: it is an exhaustive supply. The amount of pink pine that has been felled, you've got limited access. There may be the potential there for Ngāi Tahu to leverage off the Crown as a treaty partner to gain access to living pink pine. However, I didn't explore that in too much more detail. Certainly the stumpage fee agreement payment is in the process of being reviewed too, so that's about the end of it. So that's where, as I say, as I started off with, it deviates from your traditional master's or doctorate focus in that the MBA prescribes a more practical, hands-on approach to its project. So that's about it. I hope you've got a lot out of it. It consumed pretty much my whole life, as my wife would attest to, for 2016. So, but it is good to see some tangible results coming out of it, and Ngāi Tahu Forestry Estates have taken my recommendations on board and are actually following them through. So if you've got any questions, fire them my way.